From point-blank confessions to groundbreaking cold case solutions, this powerful conversation explores the personal sacrifices, departmental politics, and the unwavering determination required to bring closure to decades-old crimes. Out of all the cold cases that you've solved, obviously the Point Defiance Park being kind of the feather in your cap, what other one do you take a lot of pride from your... I almost felt like you should be a lawyer. I mean, you are just, the way you describe the investigation and the sticky notes and the continuous of asking of questions. What other case sticks out to you as meaningful, the most meaningful?
Well, so there's one that's more recent that actually isn't in the book because it just got that I'm, very happy about. And this was, I mentioned earlier that we got a law passed in Washington called Jennifer and Michelle's Law, and it expands our DNA collection law to allow DNA samples from deceased offenders to be entered into CODIS regardless of the conviction date. And prior to the law, if someone was convicted of like a rape or a murder before 1990, they did not qualify to go into the DNA database, which really makes no sense when you think about it from a cold case perspective, because law enforcement is investigating cold cases from the 70s, 80s, even earlier. But if we don't have the offenders in CODIS who were operating during that time frame, then we're missing out, right? Like we're missing out on solving cases. So that was really a big motivation for me to get that piece of that legislation passed so that we could enter these guys that were operating back in the 70s and 80s. So once that law passed in 2019, and it took us 4 years. So it was 4 years of going down to Olympia, testifying in front of various legislative committees, educating, legislators on our DNA laws and what the shortcomings were, and finally in 2019 getting it passed. So once it passed, I had somebody in mind, an offender in mind, who was executed in Washington in 1994. He was convicted of aggravated first-degree murder ×3. So he was actually a rapist who sexually assaulted a woman, blitz attacked her and her infant daughter at her home. He went to prison, got sentenced to 30 years, but he got out after less than 6 years. And he was living in a halfway house, not too far from where she lived. Unbeknownst to her, he was out. He came back and basically committed a triple homicide, revenge murder. Murdered her 8-year-old daughter, and her neighbor who had testified against him at his trial. So this guy is like the spawn of Satan, basically. I mean, he's like the worst of the worst. And so he was my poster child when I would, talk about how we needed to change the legislation in Washington, because I was like, this dude needs to be in CODIS. He's not in there. He doesn't even qualify. So he needs to go in. And so he was my number one target once we got the law passed. I was able to track down a sample of his DNA from his autopsy, and I literally hand-delivered a sample from the autopsy to the crime lab. And then I didn't hear anything. And so I just assumed it went into CODIS and there were no matches, but it didn't really surprise me. And then 3 years later, I get a phone call from a cold case detective in Seattle, and this was December of 2023. And he calls me up out of the blue and says, hey, I just got a hit to Charles Campbell on a 1975 cold case murder of a UW student, graduate student from UW. And it was like, holy shit, I cannot even believe this. This is insane. But it's like, right there, it's like, okay, this is validation that this is why, I keep talking about missing offender samples and CODIS and lawfully owed DNA, and that family finally has some answers. And yeah, he's not going to be prosecuted. He's already been executed by the state. He was actually the last person in Washington to be hanged. But, now the family knows who did it. And now the law enforcement agency can stop spinning their wheels, investigating a case that, could be solved with a CODIS hit.